Do we have to do that from here? Yeah, just, I forgot to turn it on over. Yeah, that'd be fine. Yes. Hey everybody, I'm Ann Raridan. I'm with the Sustainable Blacksburg, the host of these programs, and we're happy to see everybody here. We have some folks in the room here at the library and a number of people online. So we're excited to have Steve Kruger here with us. He with Live, Work, Eat, Grow. He is the coordinator for the community garden program. So, Steve.
Hello, everyone. I'm the garden coordinator for Live, Work, Eat, Grow, and I'm very excited to be here today. I want to thank Sustainable Blacksburg and the library for having me come. It's been very good for me. I've been on this job since August, and this is the first presentation I've given, and it's really helped me kind of think about what I do in a different way. And so originally I was going to talk to everybody about what you can do this time of year in your garden, which we will be talking about. But I'm not a trained historian. I'm also not a trained horticulturist. And when you're a community garden coordinator, a lot of time you have to wear a lot of different hats. But I'm a history enthusiast, and I've found recently that the more I learn about the origins of community gardens and the origins of community gardens in Blacksburg, the more fascinated I am by, in some ways, how much things have changed, and in some ways, how much the past kind of informs the present. So we're going to kind of try to cover 4 areas today. We're going to talk about the history of community gardens, broadly speaking, a little bit about the history of community gardens in Blacksburg, a little bit about what our organization Live, Work, Eat, Grow does in Blacksburg, including our community gardens. And then we will have some time at the end to talk about garden recommendations and resources. And I'll say too, I know there's probably a lot of people in this room and a lot of people watching at home that have been involved in the community gardens here a lot longer than I have. So this is something that I'm sort of learning about. And if you have anything you want to share afterwards, feel free to email me or throw something in the chat, because I would like to learn more about some of the, particularly the early days of community gardening in Blacksburg. But this will be sort of an overview. So people, I think, have a lot of different associations with what a community garden is. I think for a lot of people, a community garden is like, you know, it's that one area of the neighborhood. They're in neighborhoods, right? They have little plots in them. Sometimes they have lots of weeds. Sometimes they don't. But I want to kind of say at the outset, just to kind of talk about what our overarching goal here is, that our goal is for every resident in town that needs a place to grow their own food can have access to that land. That's our goal. Now, you know, where our demand is outstripping our supply right now, which we'll talk about, but that is our goal. But community gardens through their history have been a lot of different things. There's been a lot of different ways that they've been done to meet different needs and different goals. And this is actually 2 pictures of the same community garden. This is the biggest community garden in the United States. It's Shiloh Garden in Denton, Texas. It's run by a church, and it has a huge area of individual plots. So these are all plots for households that grow their own gardens. But then they also have a giant farm that's communally worked, that is used to produce food that they give to their various charitable organizations they're affiliated with. So when we think about a community garden, are we thinking about something where everybody has their own little space? Or are we thinking about something where there's a shared space? And is it, who are you growing the food for? Who is it for? These are other questions that come up. And I think one helpful way to think about this is that really, if you look at the history of agriculture in general, communally worked land in some sense, I think has been the norm and not the exception over the course of history. You can look at this image. This was made in 1585 by John White, who's an explorer and artist, and he made a lot of the earliest depictions of Native American communities in the Eastern Seaboard. And even though they were, you know, depicted through a European's eyes that kind of colored it, he did gather a lot of useful information. And you can see at this village, Secretary, in North Carolina today, we see communally worked corn fields and other agricultural fields. So among indigenous communities here and in other places around the world, working communal plots of land was the norm, whether it was your family or your town or another subgroup within the group of people. So it's something I think we should also think sometimes about, is this an unusual thing, or is the idea of people, just growing their own place the norm? I'm not going to show a lot of text. I'm mostly going to be showing pictures, but I do have a few things that I want us to be keeping in mind as we look at these different kind of things from history. And that's, in what ways are community gardens multifunctional? And then some of these things can be seen as benefits, and some of them are just kind of things that community gardens do. So one of the chief things, first of all, actually, who's ever been to a community garden? Oh man, I'm preaching to the choir for the most part. Who's been to the community gardens in Blacksburg? All right, awesome. Okay, well, a lot of this, you guys might already know, but we're just going to review it for a little bit. So one of the ideas is food security, right? So enabling people that either don't have access to land to grow food, we don't have access to nutritious food, who live in places where, due to circumstances or whether it's an emergency situation or just the conditions of the place, the food supply chain is not very good. There's an idea of public health associated with community gardens, that being outside is healthy and growing your own food is healthy. There's the social idea that being with people, having a sense of community gardens create community because they create a place for the community to exist. That is something that's positive. The idea of having community gardens as green space, as places where not just gardens happen, but where you might have pollinator gardens, or you might have wild spaces that are being conserved. And it's a place for people to connect with those green spaces and connect to nature. A lot of what we'll talk about is tied to urban reform and industrialization and post-industrialization. So the idea that you had in the 19th and 20th century, basically the movement of the majority of the people from the country all over the world to the majority of the people now living in urban areas, and what that did to foodways, traditional foodways, and food production. Connection to local food and agriculture, that's another theme in community gardens. A lot of times it's a bridge both for consumers and producers. Cultural continuity, we'll talk about how community gardeners help rural people carry on their traditional foodways and cultural practices, and people from other countries and other parts of the world continue their cultural practices and foodways. Kids, so community gardens throughout their history, there's always been an idea that getting kids outside, getting kids in gardens, getting kids to know where their food comes from are all beneficial for education and child well-being. And then finally, we have sort of political, ideological, and spiritual functions. So a lot of times community gardens might be associated with movements that are trying to achieve other things, through which community food is a way to sort of organize. So also we should keep in mind, it's not always a rosy picture. There's many challenges of operating community gardens. The chief one in Blacksburg right now is we have a huge wait list. I know if this time of year, I always get emails from people. We have 3 community gardens. We've added 2 in the last 2 to 3 years. But we have, every year we have about 10 to 20 spaces. And right now we've got 60 people waiting. So that equals about multiple years of waiting list. So that's one issue. Because you might have new gardeners, you have issues with gardener drop off. And sometimes that means that plots don't look as tidy as some people in the garden and outside the garden might want. But I would say that if you took any 15 gardens, including my own some years, and threw them in one place, that would probably be the case. So different aesthetic standards. And then finally, communities are complicated. People have to get along for these things to work. And so that's something you always have to think about too. And then finally, are they actually able to meet the things that they're trying to do? So let's go way back. We talked about indigenous communal farming. That wasn't just in the Americas. If we look at Europe, under medieval farming schemes, essentially the way it worked was that peasants would be farming some lands that were given to whoever the landowner, the lord was. And actually, usually the lord, not a landowner, because usually the king owned all the land in theory. And the peasants would be given either strips, family strips that would change every year to grow, or they would grow communally worked plots. Then beginning in the 18th century and really kicking up in the 19th and early 20th century, those areas started to get what they called enclosed at the time, meaning they went from this kind of feudal system of agriculture to where there were single landowners And a lot of people got pushed off the land. We had a ton of people moving to the cities. In a lot of cases, the food that they were eating drastically got worse. It was less fresh. There were less things available. Poverty increased. People were living in cramped, dense housing. This is the time of tenements. It's the time of the Luddites. And there was a lot of civil unrest, and it was very, very hard for people. So all across Europe, starting in Germany, they started creating what are called allotment gardens. And in Europe, a community garden is called an allotment garden still. And the idea was that you had all these rural people moving to the cities. You had all this unrest happening and all this demand, people wanting to reconnect with their agricultural background, wanting fresh food, needing fresh food. And so in several countries, there were laws passed that required municipalities to offer places for people to farm. And this happened all over Europe. In some places, there were organizations that were created to manage them. In some cases, it was done through churches. Some factories created their own community gardens, but it was legally mandated. And this one is in Sweden in 1915. It's pretty expansive, but you can see the factory in the background. But in the United States, the oldest existing community garden is in North Carolina. You guys can go visit. You can even get a plot in it still, but you have to grow period 18th century vegetables and herbs. It's called Bethbara, and it's near Winston-Salem. It's associated with the Moravian community. And so things were a little different when people came here for the first, in one of the only cases in history, all of a sudden it was very possible for individuals to own land, which in Europe, most other places in the world hadn't really been a thing. But in some cases, there were these communal groups like the Moravians, who in the Moravian church at that time, all the men lived, single men all lived together, and the single women all lived together. And they had their own community gardens. And this one is still around. And one thing I think is really interesting about it is, in a lot of ways, if you look at the original plans, which they still have the original plans for, it wasn't just a survival garden. Even at that time, they were thinking about these multiple functions. So they had a whole garden that was just medicinal plants. They had plants that they didn't really have like pollinators per se, but they had plants that had multiple purposes like that in the garden, which is a very we think of as a new idea. And it was also, they were cool looking. They're supposed to be beautiful. So they were going in different directions and different shaped plots and things like that. I really want to go down and check it out sometime. So like I said, we didn't have this kind of transition from serfdom in the United States, but we did have a lot of immigration and urbanization happening by the end of the 19th century. And there was also a ton of economic instability. So one of the early ways to address this, and this is very fascinating, it's called Pingree's potatoes, was the way this started. And this was a guy who was a shoemaker and factory worker who became the mayor of Detroit in the 1890s. And what he did, which was very progressive at the time, was he said, we have all these people sitting on these land holdings in the city that aren't being used. They're all being held for speculation. And we have this huge influx of immigrants at that time, primarily from Eastern and Central Europe and Southern Europe, that are all farmers. And they've come here to work in various things. And there was huge unemployment. This was after the panic of 1893. There was very little of a social safety net. And his idea was, let's just take that land. We're not going to take it, but we're going to, while nobody's using it, say that people can grow food on it. And so this was done on hundreds of acres in Detroit in the 1890s and was, by most accounts, a successful program. And it was duplicated in a lot of other cities all across the country, where there was, in some cities, hundreds or even thousands of acres under production, like heavy agricultural production. So this wasn't like the kitchen garden. This was people growing like crops for sale, unemployed people growing crops for sale. Very interesting. And this idea of kind of community gardening as a way of addressing social inequity, economic inequity, and kind of issues with urban renewal is something that really picks up in the 20th century. We're going to jump ahead for a minute, but particularly in the 80s and 90s, there were a lot of movements in cities all over the country to have community gardens in urban areas, especially in places that were increasingly being thought as food deserts, where you couldn't get fresh food. And so it's become in some places really associated with local political organizing and education as well. So that's another constant stream that we see beginning in the 19th century, is the idea that children who have been separated from agriculture and from the land can benefit from learning about nature and about where food comes from, which is something I think most people would still agree with. And this, so there started to be a lot of proponents of what they called school gardens. So this is one in the 19th century. It really stepped up during World War I. This is a flyer for the school garden program that started before we got into World War I. But when the supply chains from Europe that supplied seeds and a lot of our produce started to break down. And again, I love people thinking about, what are community gardens? Where are they? Sometimes they're on rooftops. This is a really cool rooftop kids garden in New York around the turn of the century. And then this one is from Washington, D.C. in the 1980s. So this is something that's still very important. It's important to us too. We'll talk about some of our kids' programs as well. Now, this is probably the most common association most people have with community gardening that's not sort of 60s, 70s oriented, which is the Victory Garden. Did anybody grow up working, did anybody here or their parents talked about having a Victory Garden? Yeah. So this was a very common thing during World War II, again, when supply chains began to be affected by the war, and a lot of farmers were going off to fight in the war, and in general, basically everything was changed. There was a massive movement to grow food in everywhere, basically at home, in community gardens and individual plots. And so a lot of community gardens were created in the 1940s. And in Europe, this was also the case in a large sense due to the disruption of agriculture by war and disruption of everything. So this is an amazing photograph from England. This is a garden that was created in a bomb crater in Westminster, on the grounds of Westminster. And so during the Blitz, when it was very hard to get food in and out of London, there were a lot of community gardens, and I think that's a very powerful image. And I'm impressed. Like, it's very nice looking in there, Like so they must have brought in salt. They must have had to bring it. That's my comment. Where did they get their raised bed soil? It looks really nice. This persisted after the war too, until the Marshall Plan got started. This is Berlin in 1946, right after the war. People farming in the ruins in downtown Berlin. And it's an issue that still stays with us. So this isn't war, but this is another disruption of global supply chains. You can do a Google search and find essentially the exact same article written about every community garden in the country. And I didn't put them all on here because they're all paywalled now, including the Roanoke Times. But they did an article on us and the Roanoke gardens as well, because during the pandemic, gardening and community gardening became very popular because it was harder to find food. I don't know if anybody remembers how hard it was to find garlic. That was one of those things like paper towels that people went nuts about. Garlic was very difficult to find. People also wanted to be with each other, and being outside with each other is being safer than being inside with each other. And community gardens were a place to come together. And local ag in a lot of ways has really benefited from this awful situation. It's one of the few things is that people started really thinking about where your food comes from and how we need to have a little more resilience built into our food systems. So still, community gardens can play a role in helping shore up our food systems and supply chain. So now we're going to move into a little bit of, and I'll say too, if you guys have questions at the end, we'll have some questions and discussion at the end. Now we're going to move into a little bit of community garden history, a little closer to home. And this is something I'm still learning about, and I keep learning about new community gardens, not new community gardens, but community gardens that I didn't know existed in different neighborhoods in Blacksburg. So you're going to notice there's some big holes in this. I'm hoping you all can help me fill in some of those if you can. But the earliest mention, other than Victory Gardens, that I can find to community gardens in Blacksburg is the 1970s, when Emily Stewart, who is the much beloved director of the YMCA, founded a community garden program that was basically the Y working with Virginia Tech and connecting students with community members to find places to garden. And I believe the first garden was actually in her at her house. And that lasted for a long time. But eventually the large garden in I believe it was the largest garden in Blacksburg, was on Harding Street by the cemetery. Now in the mid-2000s, that area was redeveloped and the garden needed a new place to be. So at that time, Arlene Hale, who we will meet a little bit more in a second, agreed to open her home to the community gardeners that were at that site. It started in 2009 with a solar greenhouse put together with the help of David Roper at Virginia Tech. And the next year, a full, basically acre plot of large plots, large individual plots was made, essentially in her backyard. And we'll see some pictures of it here in a second. In 2019, that land was donated to the town of Blacksburg for its continued conservation as a community space and a community garden. So here is that kind of, this would have been better to show you this more of a timeline. That's just what I said in timeline form. But I'm very interested in this period, you know, of learning about other small neighborhood or whatever community gardens that were going on in the 80s and 90s in Blacksburg. So just to show two people that, you know, are that at this point, and especially with the garden's history with our organization, are super important, and I'm sure a lot of you probably know. This is Arlene Lambert, who donated the land for the Hale Garden and also contributed funds to help it be managed and continued. And then Jenny Schenk, who is the garden coordinator at this time, and for 11 or 12 years. Sorry, Jenny, if it's 12, not 11. But and they've been instrumental in helping shape the garden. So I wanted to acknowledge both of them. And let's see, let me get this. So this is the Hale Community Garden. This is our biggest garden. And the oldest garden of the three that we currently manage. It's located at the end of Maywood Street off of North Main, between 460 and Mount Tabor. As we said before, it started, this was originally a pasture, and then that building behind the plot is the solar greenhouse. That was created first, so people can grow food all year round. There's 15 plots in there that people can rent, grow greens and things. And then this is one of two garden plot areas. We have a total of about 60 plots there, a few more than 60. And the solar greenhouse, we also have a community orchard and a community food forest where there's multi-story trees in production. Yeah.
It looks like you have a communal fence against rabbits and deer.
Yes.
It goes around the whole community garden.
Yes.
That's a lot more efficient than putting a fence around those little plots, right?
Yes. Well, yes and no. So we do have a large fence that keeps the deer out. And we've found that gardeners still sometimes like making fences in their own plot because the current fence is less effective at keeping out rabbits because they'll chew through it sometimes. It's very effective. Around here, if you don't have a deer fence, you're completely out of luck. In most places in Blacksburg, which is a big draw for the community gardens because some people either don't have the means to put up a fence, the physical ability to put up a fence, or live in a neighborhood where you're not allowed to put up an 8-foot tall fence in your backyard. So yeah, the fence is a huge asset and a very important part of the garden. And the next time we do it, it's been there, that one's been there for 11 years, it's holding up. And we're hoping next time we'll do all metal, which will hopefully keep out the groundhogs and rabbits. But it keeps out deer very well. But that's a huge, protection from predation is one of the big benefits of this type of community garden. And it also helps kind of contain the space. So this is a public space. This is on town property. You all are welcome to visit it. Don't pick anybody's food, but you're welcome to go visit it. So it's kind of an intersection between a public and private place, and also having a fence, kind of delineates that in a nice way, which I think is helpful. Cookie there. Oh, sorry, guys. Your standard Zoom talk, technical difficulty moment. There we go. Okay. So in addition to the growing space, and this is something I always really want to drive home, the community gardens are a space for people to be together. It's a community space. So in addition, that's the solar greenhouse over there, that red building. And then this is a pavilion that was erected in the early days of the garden and donated and erected by a timber frame company. And it's a space where we meet for potlucks and presentations. This was at a tree chopping workshop we did in February, and that's why everyone looks really cold, but they're having fun. And so now I kind of want to talk about how the gardens transitioned to be a part of Live, Work, Eat, Grow and what Live, Work, Eat, Grow does. So the garden predated us, but around the same time, there was another project going on the other side of 460, which was the revitalization of the Price's Fork School, the old school. And this was another kind of thing that's happening across large parts of, especially rural and urban America, where old school buildings, which have been also really centers for community and places that people really identified with, are being phased out in favor of new buildings, and the future of those buildings is often in question. Sometimes they're reused as something interesting, and sometimes they get raised and put in the ground, which is often very sad for the people that live around there. And at this time, there was a project to develop the old Price's Fork School into something that, again, had multiple functions. So the idea was it would be a place for affordable, multi-generational living. So the classrooms would get converted into apartments. There would be common spaces created that would both be a place for people to get together and a place to provide income for small businesses and for the community as a whole. So that has happened at the old Price's Fork School now with Moon Hollow Brewing and the restaurant that's there. Oh my gosh, I have to go to the restaurant. Thank you, Orange Chair. And the other idea that was there was to create a commercial kitchen that could be a place that is providing a space for small businesses who need, small food-based businesses who need infrastructure and commercial space and access to equipment and kitchens that are up to snuff, because a lot of times you can't do these sorts of things, even if you want to make sauce or something small at home, as well as caterers and other small businesses, and also be a place where we can have educational activities related to food and a place where food could be produced for the community at large. And this became the Millstone Kitchen, which is our other big project area. So the community gardens, other big project areas, Millstone Kitchen, and Lena, who's our executive director, is also the manager of that kitchen here with us. That's our wonderful logo. And one of the other programs that's operated out of Millstone is the Neighbors in Need program, which is a program where caterers are paid to provide healthy, prepared meals for community organizations that distribute food to people who need it. So we work with partners all over Giles County, Montgomery County, and Blacksburg to distribute food. And I use this because this is from our website, and I'll be having a link to the website here later. But it's also part of my job to mention as well that you can always donate to our organization if you go visit the website, because we really do rely on community investment and generosity of people. So at the same time, this project was getting underway, and the garden had been donated to the town. It seemed like a good fit at the time to have the gardens be managed by this organization, because we kind of both the two sides were working at the intersection of community, of food, and of all the multiple ways that those things come together to strengthen and build our community and our region. So originally the name was Live, Work, Eat, Gather, which some of you might remember when it was more concentrated in the Price's Fork project. And then as the gardens have become part of it, we're now called Live, Work, Eat, Grow, because those are all the things that kind of embody all the different aspects of what we do. So now we have we've gone from, since that's happened, we've gone from 1 garden to 3 gardens. We now have 118 garden plots and counting. For all of you on the waiting list, we are working hard to try to create more garden spaces in town and outside of, and hopefully eventually outside of town as well. With the help of one of our gardeners, Matt Nottingham, we were able to calculate that our gardens produce about $66,000 of produce annually for the families who use them, which can make a substantial impact. We didn't do this alone. This was done with the help of lots of partners and volunteers and other organizations that we partner with. And along the way, we had a lot of fun doing it. This was the first garden that we expanded to. This was in Long Park. It was actually really established in 2020, but the process was started for approval in 2019. But it's located downtown. This is Long Park, right off of Progress Street, close by Harding Elementary. And that green square, the Google image still hasn't updated to show the garden, but that green square is where the garden is. And this was done strictly, basically entirely with volunteer help, and we had help from the town and was getting water lines and delivering some infrastructure as well. But you know, just thinking about our design and how it fits into the multifunctionality of gardens. It's in a public space. It also has some other places that you can meet. There's a playground nearby, so kids can play on the playground. The plots are fairly big. All of our garden plots are fairly big because we want people to be able to make have gardens that make an impact on their lives and their households' food budget and food intake. And we also have started to do this kind of fencing, which gives, you know, some privacy also for the neighbors and the people, the other people in the park. So sometimes, you know, if you're like me and you might leave some tools out of the garden or something like that, you don't necessarily have to see it. Last year we added another garden. This is in Cedar Hill Park off of South Main, off of Ellett Road. So you can see here's Ellett Road. Cedar Hill goes up and it's in the Cedar Hill Park. Same kind of setup, same kind of fence, a grid with I think 15 plots in it. And we're hoping to expand in the next few years. So want to talk just about a few other things and sort of benefits that we have from the garden program. One which was I've sort of mentioned, but this is really one of my favorite parts of my job and one of my favorite parts of working at the garden. And we're very international. We have gardeners from all over the world, over 20 countries. And a lot of folks really like having the garden space because they grow crops that are hard to find at home. And these are just 3 examples. It's Chinese yam, loofah, and bitter gourd. People also grow things like long beans. They grow chili peppers that are specifically used for specific purposes. All kinds of stuff from all over the world, and learning from people and their different kind of experiences with agriculture and gardening has also been a really wonderful experience for me, and I think is a big part of the community garden experience. In keeping up the tradition of community gardens as places for education, we do educational programs and demonstrations and workshops. Some of these are for kids. We have a Seeds to Supper summer camp that we do in the summertime. That's available. You can check it out on the Blacksburg recreation page. You can sign up your kids to come and learn about where their food comes from and creatures that live in the garden, and they'll get their hands dirty and come home and want to plant a bunch of stuff in the yard. And we also have workshops that are for all ages. This is again our tree tapping workshop where we taught people how to make maple syrup and other tree syrups in their backyards. We work with Virginia Cooperative Extension and other organizations that do educational activities. We had a tree cleaning workshop recently. We had a soil testing workshop and a soil test interpretation workshop. So we try to have education be a big part of what we do as well. And we don't do it alone. We have lots of partners. Obviously, town of Blacksburg gave us land and gives us office space and lots of wonderful resources, funding. We get funding from the town as well. They're a huge partner. DCE, which we mentioned, the Master Gardener program, they have great volunteers that come out. They've made us a beautiful pollinator garden and take care of a lot of the common spaces. The New River Glean team, which we'll talk about more in a second. Boy Scouts, the Girl Scouts, and Virginia Tech provides a ton of volunteer help through a lot of their programs. We work very closely with civic agriculture, and there's also service organizations like GIVE, Alpha Phi Omega. Every once in a while, the Corps Cadets comes down and knocks something out. Huge out in a day. And then VT Engage in a big event, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. And I also wanted to point out that we're not alone in what we do with community gardens. There's a lot of other folks doing similar or different things, sort of in the same vein around the region. And I wanted to mention a few of them. The Pharmacy Garden, that upper right-hand picture is in Christiansburg, and I believe they have one in Pulaski as well. They're operated by the health department. And so it's an example of a continuation of gardens that are operated alongside relief or governmental agencies. And they have 2 great gardens with raised beds where you can rent plots, and they also do educational programming. I think they do yoga in their garden, which is really cool. The middle picture is the Giles Community Garden, which is in downtown Harrisburg, and that's run by a resident of Giles County. Who basically, that's one large garden, that's run with volunteer help, and then the food is for whoever wants it. Charlie, who runs it, calls them his night gardeners, and he welcomes people, whoever needs food, to come by at any time of day, but he says often they come at night to get what they need. There's also neighborhood gardens in Blacksburg, such as the Airport Acres Community Garden. And then the new, there's a Virginia Tech community garden that's the Virginia Tech Indigenous Garden, where they do use indigenous agricultural methods and also have demonstrations and workshops out there. And that's at the Turf Grass Center. There's information about that on I think it's, well, you can look at the Food Center site to see some information about the Food Center for Food Studies at Virginia Tech. And the New River Glean team, which I mentioned, they've had plots at our community gardens, but they grow food at various places around, and also try to collect food that isn't being used and distribute it to food pantries. So let's see, before we move on to that, does everyone have any questions about we're exiting the historical part of our program and entering the gardening part of that program. So I was going to see if anyone had any questions.
I'm just wondering if you have, or know personally of, and this is the Mormon community garden, or if anybody here, I live real close to it, but I've never been able to make contact, but I'm just kind of curious if do you have connections?
I do
with
not have
Mormon
connections,
church?
but I want to have connections to them. If
Yeah,
you are out there in
fabulous
Zoom
events.
land and are connected to the Mormon community garden, let me know. But no, that's cool. I didn't know that. No?
That's Hamburger right now.
Oh, okay. Where is it? Okay. Well, it's off Energy Drive, and they have a nice big fence, real nice fence. I have a feeling there's a lot of turnover to the people that work it, so it seems like it's, a lot of turnover.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I wondered if you have any estimates for like how much it costs to start a community garden? Like, the running the water in, the fencing, the raised beds, the soil, that sort of thing.
Yeah, so it really depends on how you do it. So, and I will also say that establishing a community garden, you can often find funding to establish a community garden. It's much more difficult to find funding to maintain a community garden, which is another thing that, is an ongoing issue. But it really depends on what you want to do. Like raised beds, will add a lot of cost, because if anyone's been to, Home Depot lately, you'll know that the cost of all construction materials is through the roof. Some gardens have got around that by using cinder block raised beds, or just not using raised beds at all. People like raised beds because they're easier to control, and in some places, especially urban areas, they have to use brought-in soil, because in a lot of sites, they might be contaminated with lead or with prior industrial pollutants. So a lot of places have to do it. If you live in a place with deer, you have to have a deer fence. If you live in a place where you don't have to have it. And that'll really, that's several, that can be several $1,000s right there. So really, I don't have a number, like this is the amount of money it takes, but it's thousands of dollars. And that's for a small, you can go as high as you want. But yeah, it's a substantial amount of money. But sometimes, sometimes communities organize and are able to do it. Some of the guy in the neighborhood is a contractor and he'll donate. When this garden was getting started, and still, we rely on a lot of donations, not just of money, but of materials and time. So that can make a big impact as well. But yeah, putting in water, if you don't have water, that's a huge expenditure. If you want to do rain barrels versus adding a hydrant. Sorry, long answer to a short question, but that is the question. Yeah.
I was shocked to hear that it costs $200 to rent a rototiller.
Yeah.
That's outrageous.
That's a lot of money, yeah.
So maybe the garden club needs to have some rototillers.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. That's a part of community gardens as well. That's both like a resource, like we have tools that people can use.
Yeah.
That are in the community garden. But then that's a question that maybe there should be neighborhood for buying the broad forks and your tillers, and they're more expensive.
Yeah, speaking of rototillers, I have a Troy-built rototiller that is sitting in my shed that I really want to get out. So I've taken pictures, I figured. And I was thinking about, like, if there was a community garden to donate it to, But yeah, it's just sitting, sitting in my shed.
It's nice, very nice.
The new science is that you don't grow the shrubs. You add on top of the existing soil, kill the grass that's there and add on top of it, and use mulch and leaf mold and other stuff, because when you till, you bring up the weed seeds that are in there, and you also destroy the structure of the soil, which is really important.
This is as good a segue as could possibly exist into the next thing I was going to talk about, but I'm sorry, do you have a question?
Yeah, I think it connects to the rototiller conversation, which is how do you attend to conflicts when it pertains to practices that, so like if someone is a pesticide, herbicide-free patch, and their neighbor happens to love Roundup, and like it aerosols, how do you stay out of it? Do you all have community rules that have been established? Like, how do you govern that?
So let me preface this by saying I'm learning how to do that. Is an ongoing learning process that I'm learning how to do. But I will say that we do have a set of guidelines that encourages certain practices, and we are organic in terms of our soil amendments, and we're especially, sometimes with, people do it anyway, because in some cases, especially I find with fertilizers, like it's kind of hard to tell sometimes with certain things, but we're definitely no herbicide or pesticide, no non-organic herbicide or pesticide, and it's supposed to be all organic amendments. Not everybody understands what that is, and not everybody complies, and that, it's something that's, like I was saying, it's a community, so we do have, there is conflict that exists. But, my take on this, there are things we try to encourage, which we're going to talk about in a second. But we also understand that there's not one way to do things. So like, I'm not going to tell somebody who's been, grew up on a farm and has been growing food for 60 years, that she needs to do this new thing that's, with the exception of things like that affect the neighbor, because there's things that affect the neighbors and there's things that are aesthetic, and that's all, that's more of a gray area. So it's something we're constantly working out. And, I think in a lot of cases, we try to have people work it out with each other because they're all in the garden together. But yeah, like a mixture of tolerance and mutual respect. But if you want, I can put a link to our garden guidelines if you're interested, and they show, what our baseline requirements are. So it's like, don't pick other people's food, don't leave trash in the garden, don't use pesticides and herbicides. Pretty basic stuff. But yeah. Oh, sorry.
So I just noticed there was a question in the chat. Somebody said, you mentioned 3 community gardens, but 118 garden plots. What's the difference in gardens and plots?
Sure. So, we have 3 garden spaces that have a total of 118 individual plots that can be rented within them. So, each garden has a certain number, is divided into spaces and you rent that space in the community garden. And that's your space to plant and manage as you see fit within the guidelines that we do.
So these are all individual plots, right? There's no communal plots growing food for the food pantry or anything like that.
So there are some that are run by Green Team that does that. We also have community spaces, like all of our gardens have a little like herb and flower bed that people can use. And then we also have, at the big garden, we have an orchard that's for everybody. And we have food forest that's for everybody, where there's berries and different kinds of edible plants. So we do have those common spaces. And we're talking about, as we expand, looking at some of those other models and seeing if, working with a local farmer or doing something together is a possible way to do something like that. That's something we're very interested in. But at the moment, it's mostly individual plots, people growing food in individual plots, or households, or people share. So yes, activities for early spring. So it's not even really, it still feels like early spring because it was so cold this weekend. But I made this like in early March, And then I realized, I was like, oh, it's the end of March when I'm actually doing this. But I think these things still apply. So what do? Everybody's itching to go get your tomatoes and throw them in the soil. Don't do it. Resist the temptation. It's not worth it. But there are things that you can do throughout the year. And the kind of strategy I'm going to talk about in the last few minutes here, very briefly, is a way that you kind of garden that kind of does require you to be doing things throughout the year. And if you can do it, it's very effective. But at this time of year, before you plant, you can be thinking about your garden infrastructure. You can be saying, how did my watering scheme work last year? Do I want to do drip tape this year? If anyone has a big garden has never done drip tape is awesome. Check it out. It'll save you water and cut down on diseases. Do I want to have everything where it was that made sense last year? Do I want to rotate my crops to kind of help cut down on disease and pests? So be thinking about infrastructure and design. We also really recommend soil testing. You can do soil tests through Virginia Tech or through private labs. Both are available, and there's information on the Virginia Extension Service about the Virginia Tech tests. Logan Lab is another popular private lab a lot of people around here use. And we are having a soil test interpretation workshop next Tuesday at 6 at the Blacksburg Recreation Center. It might be too late to get your results back if you haven't done it yet, but you could still come and see how you go through and say, NKP, what is all that stuff? We'll go through all of that and help you understand what you should do based on your results. So you can also bring in a pass test if you have any tests. Another thing we can be doing right now is seed starting. If you're planning on doing plants and you have a place where you can germinate seeds, you can order seeds and it's not too late. And we're getting close to being kind of late, but not too late to start seeds. And then there are crops that you can plant in the spring. This is a nice resource from the Extension Service that's, I think, on their Facebook page, the Montgomery Facebook page. And they also post a monthly one. So they'll say, here's what's safe to plant in March, here's what's safe to plant in April. But there are a lot of things you can put out. You can direct sow, especially in the next couple of weeks, things like peas, you can do a lot of your brassicas, your spinach, your cabbage, your kale, greens, things like that, onions. In a couple of weeks, it'll probably be safe to start putting potatoes out. But they have this helpful map or chart that's for the New River Valley that you can look and they'll tell you frost dates. Who knows? Well, it's up there. Our last frost date's the middle of May. And I know that sounds crazy, but it happens. It happens sometimes. Last year we got one. I think we got one of those last year.
When we moved here in 2001, it frosted on Memorial Day, like May 28th.
Yeah, that's crazy. I think even when I'm careful, that would have gotten me for most things. But another resource I wanted to turn you all's attention to is one that I've recently found out about and I really like because it's kind of simple and it's called For the Soil, the number 4 the soil, and it's through Virginia Tech. And they kind of do a general philosophy that we also embrace at the garden, which is kind of getting at what you all were talking about, which is that, when you're first creating a garden, you want to till this. In a lot of cases, you even sort of have to till the soil the first time you make a garden. But increasingly, over the last few, a decade, 2 decades, there's been a push to minimize soil disturbance. What we mean by that is it used to be, and I used to always do this too, every year you would go and till the heck out of your garden and you make it fine. It's so easy to work with. You get all the weeds out. My grandma's garden would look amazing doing that. And it works, but there's some downsides that we're starting to realize now, which is that when you break up the soil so much, it loses some of its structure. It loses some of its ability to regulate moisture. So it dries out really easy and it gets too wet really easy. It blows away more easily and it washes away more easily. And you also end up breaking up a lot of your biological elements in the soil, the habitat for your microbiome and your invertebrates that are also, we're learning more and more, play a huge role in soil health. So not to say you can't do it, but we encourage people to consider using this strategy, which is where throughout the year, your goal is to try to keep your soil in place, increase the organic matter, and improve the structure and feed the good microorganisms and creatures that live in it. So these are 4 ways that you can do that. Keep it covered all the time. So they encourage doing mulching. either with wood mulch or like a compost, depending on what you're using it for. Like if you're doing it around active plants, you might want to use compost, but if it's an area you just want to keep weeds down, you might want to do, straw or wood mulch, or even like a barrier, like a landscape fabric or plastic. Minimize the soil disturbance. So in this case, maybe instead of full tilling every year, you go out and you just dig it out a little bit. There's a method called double digging you use. You can use a fork just to kind of loosen the soil and remove the weeds, and then plant into that, especially if you're doing plants. So with seeds, sometimes you might need to work it a little bit better. But on an industrial level, there's a movement called no-till agriculture, where they've industrialized this stuff. There's no-till planters that go on the back of giant, $100,000 tractors, and they're doing this on a large scale. Doing it on a garden scale is a little bit different, but it's the same principle, the same idea. So number 3 is maximize living roots. So that means you're trying to feed, you're not just feeding the plant, you're feeding the soil itself. And that is also why you don't want to break it up, and also why you might consider doing something like green manure or cover cropping. So that's in the wintertime, instead of just leaving your garden bare. And you might notice, after years, it starts to sink down, you start to lose soil. You can either mulch or cover it with plastic or something, or you can plant a crop that comes up late and then leaves organic matter on top over the dormant season. And then you either, turn it in or dig it out at the beginning of the season. And there's crops that have multiple purpose. If you got clay soil, you can plant this big tillage radishes that'll break up your clay soil for you over the winter. You can plant things that are nitrogen fixing, like vetch, that'll give nitrogen to your soil over, while you're not doing anything else with it. So it can really have a lot of benefits. It's a little bit more difficult to manage, and a little bit more complicated to manage. You have to stay on top of it. And it's hard to, you still have to keep the weeds out. So it's not like it's a super easy system. There are things about it that make it complicated, but if you do it well, it can really improve your soil health, and you don't have to use as many inputs, and you don't have to spend as much money on equipment rental and amendments and things like that. But this website, if you just search for the soil, Virginia Tech, like number 4, the soil, they have a bunch of resources and videos and things that can help. So the last few minutes, I'll just open up for questions. But before I do, I just wanted to re-emphasize that you all are welcome to come out to any of the community gardens. They're town property. You can come out and check them out. They're open to everybody. And we also have events that are open to the public as well. We have volunteering days. And you can find out about all of this stuff by following us on our social, either going to our website, which is right up there, liveworkeatgrow.org, or following us either at New River NRV Community Gardens on Facebook, Live Work Eat Grow on Facebook, or Millstone_Kitchen on Instagram. And yeah, I think these last few minutes to answer any other questions or keep working out about gardening or anything else. Yeah.
Do people have suggestions on how you deal with rabbits? Because we put up a fence for deer, and we discovered, we have rabbits too.
Yeah. Trapping and eating will make a dent in them, depending on how much you can get. I think some, like, you have like the welded one, like the fence that where the holes are big enough that the rabbits can just get through, or they chew through it? Yeah, one thing you
go
can
under it, I think.
Oh, they go under. One thing that you can do, and again, you kind of have to learn to live with them a little bit, but you can run poultry wire around the base and bury, like if you can get like not the little poultry wire, but like 3 or 4 foot, and bend it and bury the bottom half, and mulch it over, and then run so that you have, a couple of feet of that thinner mesh that they can't get through and they can't shoot through. That can help a little bit. But yeah, 22 also helps, shotguns, traps, whatever.
I read stuff about different plants that you can, putting red pepper or stuff like that mixture on your plants. Has anybody ever tried that?
I'm curious.
Awesome. I take PVC and bend it with hot water and then cover the crops that rabbits tend to like, also the caterpillars eat. So it's a twofer for me. With the PVC, so it's like what do you call? I don't know what you call that.
Like a low tunnel,
not a full frame, but and then I put tool. Yeah, like a row cover. And then I get a ream of tool. that from the fabric store and drape that over and weight it down with stones. And the really eager ones maybe wiggle under, but by and large, that has solved my rabbit problem.
Yeah.
If you're able to run drip tape under one of those, that will also solve your tomato leaf, a lot of your tomato disease. Growing under like low tunnels or like any kind of little root structure, will help you with a lot of problems.
Wait, so to cover one's tomatoes with a similar fabric out in the summer?
Well, not a fabric, like if you have like
Not a
a
winter
like a plastic, like a plastic that lets the light through. You have to have some way to water underneath.
Yeah, of course.
But it'll help keep the foliage dry, and then that can help you control the disease a little bit.
Oh, nice. Like light? Like light?
Yeah.
Try. You get a fur too.
Yep.
I also have a Labrador, and the Labrador wants the rabbit.
I just wanted to say as a master naturalist, if you trap an animal, you have to kill it.
Yes.
You can't move it. You're not allowed to move wildlife. So if you trap something,
You're going out to trap in the city.
no. And you're not allowed to trap in the city. People do it, but you're not allowed to. And you can't move the wildlife. That's illegal. Move wildlife.
What about keeping chickens?
Now, there's rules on that. You can, but there's rules on it. You have to put in an application.
Like so many and not have a rooster and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hey, Ray, I just want to thank Steve for his talk. I have personally a long history with community gardens. Starting when I was a student here at Virginia Tech, and I was partnered with a senior citizen, and then many years in Northern Virginia gardening at a community garden plot. I wanted to let you all know about a few other things. As I mentioned, Sustainable Blacksburg is a community organization, and many people knew us from our partnership with the town and the university on Sustainability Week. And we have now transitioned that to Sustainability Through the Seasons. So we organize some events. We also promote related events, and I need to get with Steve to know about all the events that he mentioned. There are also a number of things coming up. So we last year started a small grant program, grants of up to $500 for projects related to our mission. And one of our recipients last year was actually the Airport Acres Community Garden to help them replace their gates and protect them from deer and wildlife. So the deadline for our first phase for this year is actually tomorrow. You can find the information on our website. There are some other events, related events coming up this Sunday at the Moss Center. Some of you may have seen there's a performance of Mosaic for Earth. So it's a concert by Dwight Bigler, and he'll be highlighting nature, and there will be some exhibits in the lobby too with some local organizations. Virginia Tech Earth Week, that they put together a whole series of events. April 16th to the 23rd, I think, are the dates. Broomin' and Bloomin' is a cleanup event happening on April 23rd. Also on April 23rd, the town of Blacksburg Arbor Day tree planting, and the library here is having a craft swap that same afternoon. Our next event here will be Beth Umberger talking about the problem with invasive plants, and we're going to have a display of some of them here too, so that you can see in person what they look like. That same day at 5:30 at Rising Silo is Science on Tap, talking about Lyme disease. And coming up in May, we're partnering with the Blacksburg Farmers Market on a movie at the Lyric, which is Just Eat It, a food waste story. So we send out notice of these events to everybody on our listserv. You can email us if you want to get on that. There's a sign up sheet going around in the room too, if you want to get on our listserv to get notice of upcoming events. And if there are events that we don't know about that are related, we'd like to help promote them too. So thank you, everybody here in the room and online, and hopefully we'll see you back here next month.
No, I don't know how to